Okay, Robert. So we have been talking about sati and the way that it comes and goes depending upon the levels of stress that we're under. This is very, very characteristic. The Buddha knew all about it. And so what we need to do to begin is to start with a stress-free environment so that we can then start to pay attention to the fact that this is not a stress-free environment at all. I've got quite a mess in here,
Sure.
but that's a whole lot better than having this mess in here and trying to be on a diet or trying to withdraw from tobacco or something else, because these are additional stresses on the body.
Right.
Now, um, any good meditator will say that uh, when the body is sick, when you're on a diet, or when you're withdrawing from a bad habit like tobacco or something, that's the time that you need sati the most.
Right.
Okay, but that's the time that it's going to be least available.
Yep.
Okay, so that means now that the right approach, knowing that, is to plan in advance to build up sati as a skill so that it's going to be there when we need it the most. This is actually very much like Murphy's Law.
Mm.
Now, Murphy's Law is kind of a joke simply because it was Murphy's Law. But Murphy's Law actually transformed first NASA and then the entire electronics industry.
Oh, wow.
And here's how it did that. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong at the last or the worst possible moment, which means that when is a rocket going to blow up is when it's under its most stress. When is
Right.
that? Liftoff time. And that's when the Explorer blew up. That's when rockets go bad.
Yeah, the
Also,
Challenger. Yeah.
when is the time when an electronic piece of equipment is most likely going to go bad? Now, this is a trick question. The time when it's most likely to go bad is when it's being handled by a human being. We're talking about like installing a hard drive into a computer.
Yeah.
That hard drive is under most stress when it is being installed.
Sure.
Why? Because that's the time when the connectors can be put in backwards. If the drive is already installed and up and running, the next time it powers up, it'll go fine because it is all plugged in. But during that plug-in time is when connectors can go, like USB connectors. People will try to shove them in upside down.
Sure.
hmm So this is the whole idea then behind Murphy's Law. It's not that anything that can go wrong will go wrong. It's the point that it goes wrong at its most stressed out point when you need it the most.
Right.
This is also with sati. The time that you need it the most is when it's least likely to be there.
Right. Totally.
Why is that? Because we're all stressed out. And that's when we need the sati. But it's
Right.
hard to remember. In fact, that quality is hard to remember. Is in Washington D.C. when I was there, I was in several offices and found that even though these, for instance, one would be in a big company that was doing work with the government, and then you'd go to a government office, and then you go to another government office, and you'd see the same wall drawing at that particular time. It had been making the rounds. And what it was is it was a line drawing of someone standing in a pond surrounded by alligators. And the caption of it was is that when you're up to your hips in alligators, it's hard to remember your original intention was to drain the swamp. And here it is that it's hard to remember. It's
Right.
hard to remember that you came to Washington to drain the swamp when you're being surrounded by the alligators.
Right. Right.
Okay. So this is the whole point then. It's hard to remember when you need to remember the most.
Right.
If we understand it that way, then that will actually influence our practice, because now we really understand that our practice is to practice sati.
Sure.
That's the number one skill that needs to be developed. Why?
Right.
Because we want it to be there as a skill when we need it the most.
Sure. So one thing I find kind of amazing about it, this experience of quitting smoking, is I still have those wonderful sati jhana moments, where I'll remember just, take a deep breath and there's the hindrance, aha, Mara, I see you. And that does still bring me the same amount of joy that it brought me before, even with the physiological stress of quitting smoking. And that's really interesting because I wasn't sure that it would. I wasn't sure that I would find the same joy, you know?
Well, about the smoking, the tobacco industry uh, kept the American culture addicted for literally decades by telling them a half truth. It wasn't a full lie, it was a half truth. And the true part of it was basically the research that they had could show that people who smoked 5 cigarettes a day or in that neighborhood, less than a quarter of a pack or about a quarter of a pack a day, they actually overall, on large statistical basis, were more healthy than ordinary people. And this helped the tobacco industry to stay in business for years. It was that half truth that people were actually more healthy overall than by smoking 5 cigarettes a day. Here's what was really going on, though, is that people who would smoke more than that, the tobacco would build up in the body more and therefore do its poisons. But when people were smoking only 5 cigarettes a day, when people would smoke those cigarettes, only getting a few of them, they made the best of it. So you can imagine they take and they light it and they get a drag and then they suck on it and then they take a really nice, long, deep breath,
Sure.
then hold it, and then almost as if the tobacco was their excuse to take an anapanasati breath.
Sure.
And while they were smoking that cigarette, they were breathing really well.
Right.
This is very interesting when we recognize that if these objects actually, because of the way that we use the objects, make us more healthy, then it's hard to see the dangers in those products or actually in anything that we do. That our whole lives are basically built on, according to what the Buddha says, is that we're looking for gratification. That because of the ignorance of the that's going in with the second noble truth, that we want things, and so we feel better when we get them. That's the gratification. Or if we don't want something, then we feel gratified by beating the tar out of it. And this gratification that we get, that begins then to mold our lives so that we go seeking for gratification without making the inspection to see whether it's really wholesome or whether it's got disadvantages on it. That this is basically the teaching of the Buddha would be what businesses have finally learned to do, that they call a cost benefit analysis. Many companies get really ruined because they bite off more than they can chew. A really clear example of that was when AOL bought Time, right? That was
Sure.
too much. They bit off way more than they can chew, and it destroyed AOL because of it. AOL could have been the biggest king in the internet,
Right.
but they didn't. They didn't do a good cost-benefit analysis. They didn't recognize all of the costs that were going to be involved with them buying. This is exactly how we operate as human beings, too, is the
Yep.
smoking. We can feel the advantage of that, the taking of the deep breath, the buzz of the body, the taste of the tobacco and all of that, and we feel gratified. But then we begin to inspect a little bit more, take some more evaluation, and you recognize that, hey, times have changed, income has changed, and now this tobacco is more expensive than it used to be, and therefore it costs more. And now it's not nearly as enjoyable because it's expensive. So that's
Right.
one of the cost benefits that we have to make. And overall, people then, when they recognize the health cost, that's when the tobacco industry fell apart. But they
Sure.
were very slow going to do so. And not only that, but they built up an entire industry of half truths that now the oil industry is using to great advantage for them to stay in business, even though they're keeping the whole planet Earth from being able to breathe well.
Right.
Right. And so these big companies will take an advantage to because the products that they have a mixed advantage, that there's cost as well as benefits, but they only want to sell the benefits and hide the cost. And it's up to each one of us to make our own evaluation to find out what is the right, is this worth the price? Is this worth the cost? And as we get wiser and wiser, the answer is more and more, no, it's not worth the price. It's not worth the cost.
Right.
Because it's too high. Let's find our gratifications at a discount.
Right. Let's find it right here and right now.
Let's find it right here, right now, without having to do much of anything about it. So this whole quality then of breathing with the tobacco is something that anyone who is quitting smoking should, um, let us say, practice, in the sense that you can take the stogie or the pipe or the cigarette or whatever like that and do what you're going to do with it in all cases, except set it on fire. This has been common. You were talking about your dad still is addicted to gum. Maybe what he could do instead is just carry a pack of cigarettes around, pull a cigarette out, and play with that for a while. Put it in his mouth, suck on it. There's a little bit of tobacco that comes with even doing that. Just don't set it on fire.
Sure.
Make sure
You
that
know,
he
yeah.
takes a puff. Because most of the benefit of the smoking was taking deep breaths, and people are not getting that with the chewing of the gum.
Right. Right. Well, it's funny. So, a couple of things. So, one is on the smoking. I feel like if I tried that method, let's say I had some cigars or cigarettes that I didn't smoke, and I just tried puffing. I know myself, and I know I would inevitably take out the lighter and light it. I
Yes,
wouldn't be able to
this
resist.
is true.
Yeah.
But the inevitable taking out the lighter, we give yourself the advantage of the inevitable. What is that? The time that it takes from the fact that you had the thought, I'm going to puff on this tobacco without having to light it up. And when was that? 10 or 20 minutes before the inevitable, you lit it up. That was 10 minutes of safety.
Sure. Sure.
So that's
Yeah.
the whole idea then is rather than thinking of it in terms of no, not now, forever, and making a great big thing, this is in fact what we mean by renunciation.
Uh,
Okay. Renunciation is not the not now, it's the not ever.
sure.
And we don't know about what the future is going to be. All we know is about what is happening right now. And so this is why the Buddha puts renunciation as an ordinary right view.
Interesting.
And people just say, wait a minute, how can that possibly be? Because there's even Pali word for it, nekama,
Hmm.
renounce, to throw it out. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's look at how renunciation actually works. Normally, renunciation is done in a ceremony. Normally, renunciation is done as part of, let us say, joining an organization, like particularly the vow of celibacy for priest, or a vow of poverty, or a vow of silence, which then puts the people on an extra, uh, let us say, an extra list of rules to follow, more
Sure.
rules. That's what happens with renunciations as we make a rule. Thou shalt not have that tobacco. And so when we want it, now we feel bad. You should not want it. Not only can you not have it, but when you do want it, you're a bad person because you want to have it. Okay, and
Right.
so this is what happens with the renunciation. It's much better to have the attitude of not right now. Okay,
Sure.
that I can postpone the inevitable one more minute. I don't have to light that cigarette right now.
Right.
That's where we look at it, is that that's why mindfulness is, in fact, we're looking at developing mindfulness. When we can have the mindfulness of grabbing that lighter and just say, wait a minute, not now. So we put the lighter down and we continue to hold the cigarette without lighting it,
Right.
taking another deep breath.
Ah.
Okay, so we
You
take
went
those
it in
deep
the middle of that one.
breaths.
Yep.
And we have to remember over and over again, this is what sati is about. Sati is to remember to what we're doing right here in this very moment, rather than sati of remembering that I made a rule for myself.
Right. And just a few comments on sati and maybe questions, but so one is I noticed that um, that the act of I've mentioned this to you before, I believe, but the act of noticing a hindrance, the ahamara, I see you, is very pleasurable. I really enjoy it when that happens. I
Yes,
don't even
that's the
say
whole
it.
point of it.
It's not
Yes,
even verbal anymore. I just notice and it brings me joy. And
exactly.
and it's also interesting because sometimes I feel I will notice some unwholesome, subtle quality of an experience that I can't even tell you what that quality was, but I notice it and I have the same aha, Mara, I see you sensation. So, it
Mhm.
might be I'm having a conversation with someone and I notice maybe the beginning of an unwholesome reaction, not even the reaction, just like a little shadow of a reaction. And I'll notice it and it'll gladden the mind when that happens, which is really interesting. Because I can't even tell you what the unwholesome thing what actually was, just that I noticed it. Um, but the other thing I was going to mention is it can be frustrating um, because I have days, and sometimes, like multiple days in a row, where all of this is going great, and then I
Mhm.
have something like the quitting smoking or the shot or whatever, maybe just a bad day for who God knows what, and it just kind of like drops off a cliff, the sati and all of this, and it's frustrating because what humans want is this, linear progression where it's just getting better every day. That's just not the way it works, even with this, I found. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe I'm doing it wrong.
Well, we started with that when we're under stress, That's just like Murphy's Law for any electronic piece of equipment. And that is that when things are under stress, it's hard to remember. It's hard to remember that when you're up to your hips in alligators, it's hard to remember that your original intention was to drain the swamp.
Right.
Okay, now that's a metaphor for every moment that we live. It's hard to remember to take a deep breath when I have all of these alligators of feelings of I need a tobacco fix.
Right.
Okay, instead of recognizing, hey, wait a minute, these alligators are telling you something. They're telling you they're hungry, and you want them to be hungry. You want them to starve.
Right.
Okay, so this is how we look at it now. Is a different way is to recognize that these things are so hard for sati, so we have to practice well. And the way that the Buddha talks about practicing, this is very subtle, but it is actually in the sutta um, spelled out in a way that when you really see it, it's profound, but most people read right over it. I see that, in fact, a lot in the suttas. One of the things that I saw in the suttas many years ago was the fact that the sutta is really, really hard to read. It's really, really hard to read because you're going to get some profound, deep insight on the first page, and the second, third, and fourth page are really hard to read when you've just been floored by some profound point on the first page of the sutta.
Right. Right. I
Now
know
I
exactly
find
what you
that a
mean.
sutta is easy. I mean, we can get through a sutta in about 10 or 15 minutes. Used to take
Sure.
4 or 5 days, one insight a day. Okay, so
Wow.
in the suttas, in the Anapanasati Sutta, each one of the 16 stages is specified in kind of a poetic little phrase, and they substitute this word and that word as they go through. And most people will only go through and pick out this word and that word and this word and that word without recognizing that it's packed inside this tight little paragraph that's repeated over and over and over and over again. And when you recite this stuff with the monks in the chanting, that's what becomes apparent. It's the over and over and over point
I've
where just
noticed
one
that. Yeah.
word is being substituted. And so the things that are in that paragraph that are repeated over and over again is the point of that. Let's take an example which we've been already discussing a little bit today, and that is gladdening the mind. That we just, it's not that we gladden the mind is one of the things that we do, but rather the gladdening of the mind, it says specifically, is a skill to be developed. Thus, one trains oneself to mindfully breathe in long while gladdening the mind. And then thus one trains oneself to mindfully breathe out long while gladdening the mind. Okay, it doesn't just say gladden the mind to number 9 and do this number 10 and do this number 11. It always has this set phrase in there that that sati or that um, gladdening the mind is to be done with full sati, to remember to breathe in long while you're developing gladdening the mind, and to remember to breathe out long while we're gladdening the mind. Now, this is quite profound because most people don't get that sense of it. They think that, in fact, that there's a lot of different objects. And one of the ways that it's taught is, in fact, that the breathing is only just the first object. It's for the very ranked beginners. It's the first thing that they do. Once they get skills, they can leave the breath behind and go do other important things like noting,
Or the nimitta. That's part of
or
the.
some nimitta or something like
Yeah.
that. And then there's other statements about the breathing that indicate that there's a whole group of practitioners who do not practice according to Anapanasati. In fact,
Bless you.
excuse me,
Have you been smoking?
no, just getting old man and talking too much.
Got it.
Uh, the the point we're looking at is that in fact the Mahasi method and the Goenka method, which is part of the Mahasi method, as well as the Sri Lankans, um, the number one sutta that they look at and get their inspiration from is the Satipatthana Sutta.
Hmm.
And yet, in everything that they need to do is in the Satipatthana Sutta, it's just kind of glossed over. That the Satipatthana Sutta is actually kind of an overview, just like the Anapanasati is kind of an overview. And because some of the details are left out of the Satipatthana Sutta, those details then get left out of the entire teaching practice that Mahasi sets up.
Sure. So I have a question on that before we
Mm-hmm.
go on with this. So when I was at Swan Moke in 2013, and also in Ajahn Buddhadasa's book, the manual for Anapanasati that I recently read, it's a very good book. They talked about the use of the nimitta. Do you ever go into that in your teaching, or because it seems I've never heard you mention the nimitta once, but I remember Dhammavidu mentioning it at Swan Moke, and I also read it in the book. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on that whole practice.
The nimitta itself was originally from the Kasina meditations that were common before the enlightenment of the Buddha. The nimittas, other than that, are not mentioned anywhere in the suttas. The nimitta was not mentioned about breathing meditation until the 5th century AD in the Visuddhimagga. The Visuddhimagga has had enormous influence in, let us say, modern Buddhism. That
Yep.
the story is that when the British came to Southeast Asia, especially to Burma, that the Mahasi method and the new way of looking at Buddhism was a reaction to the Burmese reaction to Christianity invading. This mentality of the importance of the Visuddhimagga had been there in many places, and the Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was also influenced by it. But by the 1930s, he could begin to see holes in it, and he started talking about it. But it was still in the 1950s when he was talking about Anapanasati and would still have things in there. So it would be the older literature and some of the other stuff that he wasn't looking at. But Robert and I have had long conversations about to see that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa over the course of the years came more and more into the suttas and what was actually in the suttas and started to leave the newer literature, the Visuddhimagga, behind until by the time that I had become, let us say, knowledgeable of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, I met a monk in Bodh Gaya who actually made a demonstration to me to indicate that he, and then later in Thailand, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa and all of their followers were, let us say, had fallen, the Visuddhimagga had fallen out of favor. At one point, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was known to have said that if you took the Visuddhimagga and the Abhidhamma and the commentaries and threw them into the ocean or burned them all up, that Buddhism would be better off.
Wow.
Okay. So this nimitta was really there. Now, how the nimitta actually operates when it's a real nimitta is that you take a casino, which is an object that's about, let us say, the size of a dinner plate. It's normally made out of mud or leaves. And because it's made out of mud with little rocks and stones and things like this, or it's made out of leaves, which means you have the veins of the leaves and the various colorations and things like that, that you look at this object and then you close your eyes and try to recreate the object as best you can. This takes enormous focus. And so they open their eyes over and over again and establish the details of a particular area. Then they close their eyes and see if they can remember that exactly. This is the quality of the nimitta. Now, basically, that can be done with the breathing. If you focus on the nose tip right here, then you can feel the touch between the breaths. The nimitta will be not the sensation that your breathing creates when you are breathing. The air goes in and that touches the skin and causes a sensation, and then you breathe out. And that same touch of sensation is there because of the movement of the air. But after you breathe out, can you still feel that touch or that sensation? When you can still feel it, that's the nimitta. Okay? That's what the nimitta is. Is the nimitta useful? The answer to that is it depends upon what your nimitta is. And those kind of nimittas that get the mind focused may not be as useful, and in fact, it goes against what's in the suttas. The sutta never talks about nose tip, but even in the Visuddhimagga, it's not talked about as nose tip. In fact, the word that's used is cave. Now, what is a cave? Can the cave be the nostrils, inside the nostrils? How about inside the mouth if the mouth is open? How about is it a cave if the mouth is closed where we're talking about breathing? Perhaps the cave that they're talking about in this literature is not mouth or nose or anything. It's the cave of the chest. When you're breathing in, you open and expand, and it's a cave. When you breathe out, the cave contracts. So the cave is expanding and contracting. Paying attention to that is what is in the suttas. Paying attention to the breath body, which could then be used as the cave. So possibly this nose tip stuff in the nimitta is all just bad translations.
Hmm. So,
But it is
yeah,
completely unnecessary for practicing first jhana and is never mentioned in that
sure.
regard. That in fact, all of the information about nose tips and nimittas and all of that kind of stuff is 1,000 years after the Buddha. But Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, because of his training and whatnot, included that stuff, but it was only later when he began to move it out. And the book that that was done, that Anapanasati book of where he's still talking about the nimitta, is in the late 1980s. So yes, he did continue to talk about that, but that it's not really part of the sutta, it's not really necessary, and that it's this also goes for this, that the nimitta of the breath has a value for a particular practice, and that's not what our primary practice is. The primary practice that we need to do, and it's talked about in the sutras in many different regards, the first thing is the first jhana. The way that we're talking about the first jhana is that the Buddha, first off in Sutta number 36, talks about that the real path to enlightenment is the first jhana, and he said that after he had been expert in all of the jhanas. The next point is that in the suttas, an example would be Sutta number 111, where the Buddha is talking about Sariputta, his practice. They spend a really big, long paragraph talking about the first jhana, including what it is, how to get into it, and what's to be done while one is in there. Then the second, the third, the fourth jhanas are just kind of additions to it, almost as if someone came up in the book later and made these additions to it. But
Sure.
even with those new additions to it, still the primary teaching is about the first jhana. The nimitta has the quality of the higher jhanas in the sense that guarding the breath is good for going into the second jhana, and then from the second to the third jhana is where this nimitta is really useful.
Sure.
Is for the higher jhanas. I remember talking about that to Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. It may have been that in the translation, either Santikaro missed what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was saying, or Bhikkhu Buddhadasa kind of slept over it. But
Sure.
when you and I are talking about it, and you ask me a direct question, we can go into the details of it.
Sure.
Okay, and
So,
the details of
yeah,
it is that yes, there is some value for the nose tip, but right now is not that time. We've got we've got a whale to fry, and that's a minnow.
sure. So one other question on that is, and not to focus too much on the Nimitta or whatever, but why do you think Dhammavito may have talked about it in 2013 when I was there? It was a while ago, so I don't remember this precise specifics, but I do remember him kind of giving an introduction to the whole Nimitta and talking about it, etc. And if it wasn't important for Bhikkhu Buddhadasa by the time he kind of completed his teaching, why would Dhammavito spend time, expounding upon it, etc.?
Okay, one point, and I'm not even sure that this point is relevant, but it's one piece of information that I do have, and that is that Dhammavitu only arrived at Wat Suan Mok either after Bhikkhu Buddhadasa died or when he was very ill
Oh wow.
in the
Okay.
last year of his life. This was 1993, and Dhammavitu came to Wat Suan Mok at that particular time. So
Okay.
that's when he arrived, and he did not have the detailed kind of conversations with Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. He missed those. All he had was the written literature and other monks
Got
to
it.
talk to. Okay, so that could have something to do with it. The other one is that if Bhikkhu Buddhadasa does teach about the nose tip, then that's okay for Dhammavitu in the setting that he is in to talk about it also. The reason that I don't talk about it is because I haven't met many students or any students at all who are really needing that or ready for it.
Sure.
And so it's an unneeded, unnecessary teaching that if I
Sure.
found a student that I thought would benefit from that, then I would teach it. But in fact, teaching the mantras for going into the higher jhanas is better than using the nimitta. That in fact, many people who are going to use the nimitta will use both the nimitta and a mantra. An example of that would be Buddho, Bu on the in breath and Do on the out breath, focusing just on the air moving in and out. And you can see that at the end of when you do Bu on the in breath and Do on the out breath, and that's all you're thinking. That's the whole thought for your entire in-breath and out-breath was a bu on the in and do on the out. That means that going into the space between the budo and the next budo can stretch out. Okay, and so this is where we get the mind very quiet, very silent, is by working more with the mantra than where the mind is focused. That you can actually focus right here and get into the second jhana without having to know the nimitta. So the
Well,
things then that we look at then is that the nimitta itself, the way that they use it, is very late, does not follow the sutras. Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was moving out of that over time anyway, and therefore is also for an advanced training technique that's given too early. Now, that's an especially important point because that's what I find that is the biggest problem with Western Buddhism is they want the whole show.
sure.
In other words, the first graders of Buddhism in Western Buddhism, they want PhD dissertations to read. They're not good with Dick and Jane. Dick and Jane, they don't want. They can read Dick and Jane, they can understand Dick and Jane, but they want PhD research papers to
I have a
read.
funny story about that. I think you'll like. So when I was a kid, like in elementary school, we had this program called accelerated reading or whatever, and you could read books. You would take a little quiz on the computer, and you would get points. So I found out what book in the library would get the most possible points. The reason I did was because if our table won the most points for a month, we would get a pizza party. So not a
Mm-hmm.
pity party, a pizza party. You know, better
Mm-hmm.
than pity party. So the opposite. So anyway, I found out the book in the library with the most points was Robinson Crusoe, and I was like in the third grade or something. And so I went to go read it, and it was completely impenetrable to me. You know, it's like a 19th century English, and I'm a third grader. So instead, I went and I rented the movie, and I watched the movie. The movie wasn't much better, but I still got some stuff out of it. And I went and I took the exam, and I got 50%. But the book was worth so many points that that 50% was worth more than all the other people in the whole class got. So even though I failed the thing because it was 50% of a lot, I got a ton of
Mm-hmm.
points. We got the pizza party, and then the day of the pizza party, I got in trouble for something, and I wasn't allowed to go to my own pizza party that I won for our thing. So that was the I thought you'd like that story, but
Well, it is an
it,
important story to recognize that how- that there's a famous saying, and that is that uh, our reach extends our grasp, or let us say that we can touch something, but grabbing a hold of it is different than just merely reaching it. That we can reach it, but our grasp is not. You get what I'm talking about?
yeah, yeah,
Okay. That we can touch things, but we can't grab them. And so that's what you were doing with that Robinson Crusoe book was that you could not grab it, but you could touch it.
right.
Okay, this is what we look at in Buddhism is that people who are trying to grab things that they can't, they merely touch it and they think that that's the success, when in fact we need to actually grab hold of it, especially in the sense of really grabbing a hold of the mind. Grabbing a hold of the mind and grabbing a hold of the breath is the whole point. And exactly how we do that is just a mere detail. So if we're really, really grabbing a hold of the breath, then that means that we can control it. Long, deep in-breaths, and whether we're guarding the breath at the nose tip and creating the nimitta, or whether we're just watching the breath in general, the important point is that both of those are successful because they're doing the primary ingredient of actually grasping and taking a hold of the breath and learning to control it, as opposed to the Mahasi method of just merely watch the breath. which is a much more passive activity. So, in that case, Dhammarato is absolutely correct. He's teaching a higher Dhamma than merely watching the breath, that he's going actually too far into it and taking the students beyond their ability to grasp hold of the breath, because this is an advanced technique. Now they can build up to it. This is what
Right.
we would recommend. And so I think that in ways he's actually just kind of mentioning that he's not certainly not going to be talking about it on the first day of a retreat.
No, no, I think it was day 3 or day 4 that he brought it in. So by then, the people that knew what they were doing had already gotten to a point of
Mm.
concentration where they could probably deal with it. I wasn't there yet because it was my first
That's
retreat ever. Yeah.
that's another issue that you're bringing up here, and that is that the problem with meditation retreats like that that's open to a large number of people, the retreat settings, especially the Goenka, I really started to see that in the Goenka retreats while I was there. And that is that the Goenka retreats themselves are always geared just for the beginners.
Hmm.
So taking the Goenka retreat one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other, you begin to get the foundation of what he's talking about, but that's all you're going to get.
Right.
Listen, the reason that I left Goenka was because I recognized deep inside that he was missing something. It wasn't that he just wasn't teaching something, it was that he didn't get it himself.
Huh.
There was something that he was missing.
Huh.
And it was only when I got into Bhikkhu Buddhadasa when I started to put together exactly what it was that he was missing.
Yeah.
Now, over time and reading Mahasi literature and all of that kind of stuff, I'm beginning to see where both Goenka and Mahasi is missing some really key ingredients that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was able to know. And the question is, did Bhikkhu Buddhadasa figure this stuff out for himself, or did he have teachers? The answer was he had teachers.
Sure.
He had his own teachers. We know who the teacher was, Bhikkhu Buddhaghosajarn, and Bhikkhu Buddhaghosajarn was the Sumdat of Thailand. He was, I mean, way up there. Like the king, the word Sangharaj means the king of the monks.
Hmm. Well,
Sangharaj, the king of the Sangha. And that his teacher was actually part of the member of the royal family of Thailand,
hmm.
Vijaya. So Vijaya actually disrobed to become king for a short period of time.
Hmm.
And so this noble lineage of Thailand is somewhat closely related to the royal family, and this is the lineage that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was in of royalty, and we have some fairly good evidence of what happened back then in the 1930s, because he was accused of a Sangha Dasesa. Now, the word Sangha Dasesa means to break the Sangha.
Right. I think
You
we
can see the
discussed
word
this. Yeah.
deceit. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And the outcome of that won't go into much detail, but the outcome of it was is that he was accused and then convicted or sentenced with that he's teaching the right to Dhamma to the wrong people.
Right.
That was the sentence. Okay, this came down from the entire council that he's
Oh,
teaching
and
the right Dhamma to the wrong people.
question: what exactly was he teaching that caused so much uproar?
I would say that there was kind of a list, but at the top of the list, what he was teaching was emptiness, sunyata, and anatta, and that he would go so far. I think that in fact, the way that it was handled at What So and Milk for many, many years, when people would want to come and talk about magic or powers or
Right.
rebirth or reincarnation and that kind of stuff, the typical answer was, oh, we don't talk about that kind of stuff here. We're more interested in the actual liberating teachings of the Dhamma, and none of that stuff is liberating. But if you want to, there's monks and a walk down the road someplace there, and you can go down there and talk to them about it if you want to talk about it. But here, we're not interested in stuff that's irrelevant. Okay, so that's basically the point then is that he was teaching that stuff into the far distant future or in the deep past is irrelevant. And that goes directly against the teachings of Christianity and the teachings of ordinary Buddhism,
Sure.
right? That, oh no, you are your past. That the Buddha
Sure.
actually says you inherit your own karma,
Sure.
right? But people think that that means that you inherit your own the results of your actions 300 or 400 years or 10,000 years after you commit the events,
So
rather
I
than recognizing that you are heir to your karma of your actions right now. If you stick your hand in the fire right now, it will get burned right now. That's the teachings
yeah,
of the Buddha, and this is the teaching that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was on about that got him into trouble.
got it. So I have a question. So I love talking about this stuff, and just talking about it, it is very inspiring. And one challenge in my practice has been, like, for example, one thought I had while we were talking about this stuff is to read more of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's book, The Heartwood of the Bodhi Tree, which I started, but I haven't dug as much into it lately.
That's a
And
bear, isn't it? Boy, talking
yeah,
about
yeah, it's a
reading a
good one.
book that's too far beyond us. That one takes anybody 3 or 4 books times to read that book.
Oh, it's a good one, and I'm only at the introduction, and
It
but I
gets
really
heavy.
enjoyed it. Yeah. So anywho, and I also want to read the Void Mind book that Keishan mentioned. That's also on my list. But it's funny because oh, sorry, go on.
I spend a lot of time with students talking about that particular one. Do
Okay.
things with a void mind. Now, normally the word void uh, gives people the wrong idea from the beginning. So we have to understand that what we're talking about is void means that it's void of unwholesome thoughts, not void of all thoughts.
Right. So the reason
So
I
you
bring
do
this
things
up,
with
yeah,
that avoid with a mind that's void means that you can do the activity. I mean, many people you cannot operate a computer without thinking,
right.
but you can operate a computer while thinking wholesomely. But most
Well,
people operate the computer thinking unwholesomely, and so this is the point about the void mind: is to do what you will. In fact, this is a little poem that he wrote that's difficult for most people to understand is that we think that all renunciation means that I have to withdraw from doing the things. But a real renunciation inside is to withdraw from the feelings that I have when I do
right,
those things.
right. And that's
And
the
that's
biggest thing, yep, that I got out of reading the Bhagavad Gita is they are very explicit about that in there. That's the best thing about that book as far as I'm concerned. And it's
Mhm.
been very useful for me, even though I haven't fully gotten it, or I'm not even halfway, but just knowing it's out there, it was useful. And but I was going to say one thing that was interesting is, I'm very inspired when we have our conversations. Always the day after, I feel great. I'm all about the practice. Then I notice something will come along, it'll drop off a cliff, and you know, I don't know what are your thoughts on that? How can I stop that from happening? Just keep at it, and eventually it'll stop, or
Yes, the way if you're talking about dropping
yeah.
off a cliff, which means that all of a sudden the sati is gone, the thrill is gone.
Right, that's part of it is the thrill too. That's part of it. Is like I get used to doing the practice and it brings me joy. And there's even a little bit of a thrill in it. And then I get maybe you could call it bored of the practice almost. Is like I've listened to a lot of your videos. I listened to the whole top video playlist, and I just started your series with Danny. By the way, I listen to them on 2x, so I go twice as fast you know, but I enjoy doing that. It's nice. And anyway, so It's a great series with Danny, by the way. I've been really enjoying that one. And it's inspired some other conversations I'll bring up with you later. Um, but and I find a lot of enjoyment in that. But I also find that after a certain point, it's like I've listened to too much, or I've practiced too, and then the excitement diminishes. It might be because of the physiological stress of quitting, because it did this most recent time coincide with that. But I believe it's also happened at times where I haven't had a particular stress, but I've just gotten a little tired of thinking about the practice all
Let's
the
take
time.
a
So
different view for it
yeah,
just a moment.
yeah,
And that is that um, the let's use the analogy of the student practicing the piano.
sure.
Okay. What happens the moment or the 30 seconds or the 10 seconds before he quits practicing?
He decides to quit. Like he's kind of tired. He's like, I've had enough here. And then he just
Uh-huh.
kind of maybe
So
finishes
his
doing what he's
mind,
doing and
so
then
his
quits. Yeah.
mind is no longer on the music. Now his mind is upon how he feels.
Right.
Okay, here's where we're coming from now. And that is that you're practicing sati to keep the hindrances away, and then one hindrance will come up, one thought, a hindering thought that comes up, and now it takes over and you
Right.
quit. Okay.
Right.
This is the kind of time, that's the point in time, that moment in time is when you need sati the most, is how to sustain this. Getting into that state and then learning how to sustain it means now we're on guard for the very kind of thoughts that would be in a sequence for you to go back into ordinary bad feelings. You have to be
Sure.
on guard for those. What kind of thoughts will it be that throw you out of your good space so that you can come back immediately and redouble your efforts, put the right effort back into it, and say, no, not yet. We're going to have some more joy. Thank you very much. I'm glad I caught that. I'm glad I caught the mind wandering away
Sure.
again because it's going to carry me out. Okay, so this is the new part of the new skills to be developed is not just getting oneself into a good state, but to be able to maintain that. This
Right,
is the
right.
this is
That's
what
really the big problem for me. Yep, we've hit the nail on the head. I'm totally fine at getting into a good state. That's not a problem. But it's maintaining it is really the problem,
hmm
you know.
and so being on guard with that, with the intention of I'm going to catch those kind of thoughts that pull me out of feeling good
Right,
and be on
right.
guard for those. Whack that cow.
Sure, sure. And it's funny. I find there's about four different, actually really three different types of thoughts that seem to dominate my mind throughout the day. So one we've discussed a lot, but we can still keep discussing it because it's inexhaustible, which is I need to do this, or I need to do that, or I need to plan out this, or super ego stuff. That's
hmm
number one. Number two is thoughts of an ex-girlfriend or ex love interest,
hmm
um, and that kind of thing comes up a lot for me. And I know it's useless. I know there's no point, and do return to my practice, but it still comes up. It's like a scab that just won't heal, and
Well,
it's very
it's more
frustrating.
like a secret pleasure.
It is to some extent, yeah.
Okay.
And there's
This
two
is
in
no
particular that keep coming up.
okay.
Yeah.
And in fact, picking at a scab can be a particular pleasure.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah.
Okay. So we have to give that credit. We have to be able to see the gratification because if we can't see the gratification, then it's going to be difficult to make the value judgment about the cost-benefit analysis. So you have to see the gratification as well as the danger. Okay. Now, there is an actual very good story of an event that happened between Achan Samedo and Achan Cha.
I've heard this one. Yep.
Right. So let's go to it. When you have thoughts of girls, it's okay to have thoughts of girls. They're delicious. They're beautiful. They're enticing. They're lovely. But I don't want one. This is the way to begin to recognize that it's okay to have those thoughts, but that you're not about to go act upon it, because you can see the dangers are not associated necessarily with the thoughts, because those are just lovely thoughts. But when those thoughts turns into desire, not only do I have to think about her, but I got to call her.
Right.
Now we're getting off into dangerous territory.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
Yep.
this is how we have to understand that, yes, you can give yourself credit for giving yourself pleasure. There's nothing wrong with the pleasure, but we have to recognize what the dangers are that go along with those pleasures.
Sure.
But here you are with your nekama. Now you're into renunciation, and the super ego mind state is saying you should not be thinking about girls. And deep inside there, that little child inside saying, I like it. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very true.
Okay, so give yourself credit for the fact that you do like it, but now you can change it from renunciation in that, oh, you should not be thinking about girls. You should be enjoying yourself right now. The answer is, well, I am enjoying myself right now. And I'm going to do it safely and harmlessly, because that's all it is just a thought. So
Sure.
that's the easy way for you to begin to deal with that, is to recognize, yeah, it's okay to have those thoughts. I mean, let's face it, our chemistry is a deep, deep part of us that sexual attractions between men and women is built right into the DNA. It's natural. And yet
Yep.
most of the religious people that I know of are trying to deny that natural part of them by making rules about it. And that's why the Catholic Church, for instance, have two major problems. The Catholic Church has number one major problem of being exposed and getting caught for um, the activities that the priests are having with young people. But there's another problem that the Catholic Church has had to deal with for a long time, and that is the medical issues of prostate cancer.
Uh,
Yeah, prostate cancer is widespread in celibate groups.
wow. Didn't know that.
You know
It's
why?
like it's kind of like the most useless type of cancer, though, isn't it? Like it takes 20 years to kill someone.
Well, right. So it's 20 years of self-pity, denial, trying
Yeah.
to keep a vow that goes against our nature.
Right.
And so what we need to do is to kind of go with the nature up to the point of when it gets dangerous.
Hmm.
Okay. So in New York, as well as here on the island, everywhere, the cosmetic industry has been able to infiltrate the minds of the women to tell them always, you're not beautiful without our product. You are
Right.
missing something. You're just a female, but with our makeup, Max Factor will say, you can be a gorgeous female.
Right.
And so women are working really hard to make themselves look attractive. We should give them credit for all the work that they put in. I mean, this beautiful girl right here has got $15 worth of makeup, and it took her 2 hours to apply it. Let's give her credit for her makeup. but I am not about to fall in love with a makeup package.
Sure.
That the painted face is beautiful, and I like that paint, but I don't want the face.
Sure.
You see where we're coming from with this, okay? That it's okay to give people credit for the beautification that they're making and allow themselves to be beautiful. But just because I like what they look like doesn't mean that I want it, that I'm already okay and that I can appreciate it. And in fact, the winner is the one who can really appreciate another winner. Losers can't appreciate another winner because they are too jealous. But a
Sure.
real winner, so if you're really on top of your game and you really feel good about yourself, then you can allow these beautiful girls to be really beautiful without wanting them.
Sure. So, one question about the celibacy that you mentioned. There's been a lot of talk about, and you see a lot of this stuff like on Reddit or whatever, about the power of celibacy and how celibacy is good for your practice and this and that. What's your take on that? Do you think that's just wrong, or do you think there's some truth to it? What's your view on that? Hello? Hello, are you there? Hello? Oh, hello, are you there?
Okay, you're back. All right, good. I was
Yeah.
just checking. No, my internet's still working, so it must have been on your side. In any case, um, let's go back to where you were. What did the last thing that you heard?
Um, so I asked about celibacy and how, you can read on the internet about how celibacy helped people with their practice and it gives them
Okay,
all this energy and, they reserve
all
their,
right.
seed and all of this, so what's your take on that whole, you
Okay,
know,
so I was about to talk about in within the context of Western Buddhism. Um, the Western mind is highly influenced by the original religions of the culture. And so the Western mind is heavily influenced by Christianity, and that it's hard for most people to understand that um, celibacy of priest actually there's nothing to do with celibacy. It has everything to do with marriage.
mm,
And it has everything to do with marriage because starting in the 11th century, there were enough priests who had enough bastard kids who, when they grew up and dad died, the child was able to take over the church property. And so the Catholic Church had brought about celibacy to keep the priests from marrying so that they could continue to control their property.
mm,
This actually happens in other cultures too. It happened in Korea. That if the Korean monks or the Koreans priest or whoever who was running the temple, if he had a child, then the possibility of nepotism, that when that old man died, the new child, his child becomes the leader or the abbot of or whatever of the temple. That's not possible within the Theravada tradition because one has to be a monk of 20 years to become an abbot.
mm,
But in other traditions, that was why they didn't want priests to get married, is because of the ownership of the property.
mm.
Okay. But where the whole teaching of the Buddha has to do with freedom, freedom is the issue. Okay.
Right.
And in that regard, that if you don't, if you're very, very wise, you can set up your relationship so that you still have freedom. But mostly the easiest way is to be encumbered so that you have complete freedom.
Mm,
Now, there is a sutta where the Buddha talks to lay people, where he recommends for the lay followers that they give up all of the business and household duties to the wife. Let her be the boss. We let her do what she wants to do. We give advice and consent and that kind of thing. But basically, this is what has made Thailand a matriarchal culture. Is because of the Buddha's advice, the old men recognize, hey, I don't have to work anymore. I can sit at home and let my wife do all the work. And I can just take it easy and have a relaxed, easy life and spend my time thinking about and talking about the Dhamma and not have to
Right.
worry about it. So this is another way of having freedom. And you see, that kind of freedom then has nothing to do with celibacy. It has to do with attachments. It has to do with time constraints and other things like this.
Sure.
And so just getting away from it all is basically what we're talking about here. And yet that desire that we have inside that comes from our DNA. And there's more to it than just DNA. Let's look at it from another perspective. Let us say that you had two different tribes who did some intermarriage and some intermingling so that they eventually became one tribe, except that this original first tribe over here on the right hand were very highly oversexed. They talked about sex, they thought about sex, they danced in front of each other for sex and all kinds of other stuff. But the other group just naturally were not interested in sex. Nobody cared about sex. Nobody dressed up, nobody dressed down. Sex was not an issue. You bring these two together, and guess who is going to have the most babies? The people of a
Uh,
mixed marriage, the people who have both husband and wife who were oversexed, and then we have the group of people who the wife and the husband, neither one of them care about sex. Which group is going to have children the most?
well, the
And the
oversexed one.
primitives? Precisely. This is the society where you came from. The most likely is that your parents were oversexed, that
Perhaps.
the people that their parents
Yeah.
were oversexed and the parents before that were
Right.
oversexed. On the other side of the camp, all of those children of people who were not oversexed, they were not oversexed, and eventually there's not so many of them.
Right. Right.
So that's the way of what of humans understanding that humans are way oversexed,
Sure.
way beyond what
So
our actual biology would call for. It's part of our culture, it's part of our tradition, but most specifically, it's part of our DNA.
sure. So one other thing on the celibacy, I think, has influenced a lot of people in the modern West is the whole brahmacharya phenomenon in India. Like Gandhi, talked a lot about the brahmachari practice. Are you familiar with this brahmacharya?
Way too much.
Way too much. Yeah.
Mm.
So what's your take on that whole deal?
Uh, I would put that part of it into the area of religion,
Hmm.
into the area of mythology, into the area of promise. If you do without sex for long enough, you will be awarded these powers.
Right, right. It's like 12
Okay,
years
who
brahmacharya,
is the
something like that. Yeah.
authorizing authority that's going to give those powers? More than likely, what's going to happen is if you do
Yeah.
without sex while thinking about sex and denying yourself sex, you're going to have the power of prostate cancer.
Right, right.
That's
And
what
that's
really
that's
is going to happen, not what they're promising you.
right. Well, part of the teaching though is also you're not even supposed to think about it. But if you think about thinking about it, you're thinking about it, right?
Right. And
But
guess what? They
yeah.
can't stop thinking about it. And you know that because you don't stop thinking about it.
Right, right. Well,
In
it's
fact, young
funny.
men, I would say about two-thirds of their thoughts are sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
Old men, they're down to about 1/3 of their thoughts are sex.
The better way to be, But so I gotta say too, it's funny, Gandhi. I read a spiritual biography of Gandhi. It was a great book, and he actually believed that there was a massive earthquake in India, in Mumbai, during his whole campaign for Satyagraha, for independence for India, and he believed that if he had undertaken brahmacharya earlier, that never would have happened. I think that's absurd, but I don't
Right.
know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Magical thinking.
Yeah. He's also Gandhi. He's a great teacher, but
Okay. All right.
yeah.
So Gandhi's capable of magical thinking.
Yeah,
Wasn't Jesus
absolutely.
capable of magical thinking? I mean, he drove the money
Probably.
changers out of the temple. If he'd have thought about it better, he could have gone
Right.
in and eventually, over time, with careful detail, he could have made friends with Caiaphas and then convinced Caiaphas himself that the money changers didn't belong in the temple. They could go out on the courtyard.
Right.
So
So he
Jesus
chose
could
to
have
make a
handled that
scene.
whole thing wholesomely, but he didn't.
Right.
He
Right.
had low class thoughts about it. So just because Gandhi had some low class thoughts doesn't mean that we have to throw him out completely, because he had some good high class thoughts too.
Sure.
We can think of Gandhi the same way that we think of the girl who's got her face all painted up with $10 worth of Maybelline, right? Yeah,
Right.
he's hard to be. Yeah, got to give him credit for it.
Sure.
But we can also be realistic in the sense of, yes, there are some things, and no, there are another. That in fact, wanting spiritual power is the greed that is so strong in some people that they will actually give up their sexuality in order to get, or just have, the promise of it. Okay.
Right.
And so we can see, because we have widespread, uh, not just in our time, but over many, many centuries, we have lots and lots and lots of evidence of people doing well or mediocrely at practicing the renunciation of celibacy, right? How many of those priests flap their arms and fly out of their uh, priestly quarters, out of their cathedral? How many priests do you see floating in the air above the altar?
Very
Doesn't
few.
happen.
Yep.
Doesn't happen. We
Yeah, it doesn't
have
happen.
literally hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of examples of people who have practiced celibacy for the long term for many years, some of them being very, very good at it, very great at it, and others being mediocre, but in all cases, no power.
Mm.
In all cases, no power. And so what they do is that, oh, I wasn't celibate long enough. If I had only started my celibacy sooner, I would be flying now.
Right. I mean, the big counter argument, of course, is Gandhi, right? And he had great power. Not like magic powers, but like he had a great, you know, force of personality. And I think the
Okay.
celibacy did
Donald
add to
Trump
that.
has a great force of personality.
Not like Gandhi's, like Gandhi's
How do you
was
know it's not like
noble.
Gandhi?
He does. Okay, Donald Trump does have a great force of personality, but Gandhi's was noble, so it had like a much more
Okay.
refined,
All right.
you know,
But you didn't
high
talk about
quality,
noble. You
high
didn't talk
class.
about noble. You didn't talk about noble. You talked about force of personality, as if that was a magical power. That's what you said.
Sure, sure.
Okay, people have force of personal power, of dynamism, of lying to people, of convincing them to do things, to follow, to vote, all kinds of things that are ordinary power, not magical power.
Right,
And yet people
right.
are practicing celibacy not for ordinary power. No one says, oh, I've been celibate, that's why I'm so charismatic. In fact, the
Sure.
guys who get charismatic because they're trying to chat up girls. They learn how to be charismatic to get what they want.
Sure. Totally.
So
So,
charisma has nothing to do with magical powers.
so, so another question or comment or whatnot. So, I find that a lot of my life is concerned with getting power.
Hmm.
Whether it's like working out, or like physical power, or it's, job, career, this and that, or even meditation to some extent, is pursuit of power, and it's like Nietzsche, and I, spoke about how we're all human beings are just driven by the will to power, no matter what.
There's a better
And
way of looking at it.
yeah,
Okay, we're not driven by the will to power. We're driven about thoughts of fear.
mm,
And we want the power because if we feel like that we're powerful, then that will help mollify our fear.
sure,
If someone has no fear, if they feel secure, they have a kind of power that the fraidy cat only wants and doesn't have.
sure,
This is the real power that comes from a correct practice of anapanasati, is the right attitude that I can, in fact, clean out my mind. The right attitude of I'm on top of this. I can handle anything. Now that's real power, to where people who are still dealing with fear and want power, they're wanting some sort of physical manifestation of power that they can grasp hold of. So they're looking for magical power mostly. And so the
sure.
greed for magical power is old, it's common. People spend a lot of time, a lot of energy. You wouldn't believe how much, let us say, human man hours or whatnot during the Middle Ages was spent on alchemy.
A lot. I mean, even Isaac Newton, like he spent
Hmm.
half his career on physics and the other half on alchemy.
On alchemy,
And
right.
it's
And
amazing
alchemy
because he could
is
have
magic.
accomplished so much more if he just stayed to the physics. I mean, he accomplished way more than anyone else ever will, but most likely. But still, maybe he could have done double what he did had he had that time from the alchemy. You
We
know.
don't know those kind of things, but we do know
Yeah.
that people want power because they think that they need it. And why would they need the power
To
unless
protect themselves.
for protecting themselves? And when you don't need any protection for one reason or another, and one of the reasons to not need any protection is because you're not trying to protect the self anymore. The self is not important so much. Here's
Right.
myself, have at it, shoot it all you want, you know.
You,
Say anything you
it's
want
yeah.
to about who I am because I'm not that. Whoever you're complaining about, that's not me. So if we come to that position is that the reason that I don't need any power is because I'm not afraid, and the reason that I'm not afraid is because the target is safe. The reason the target is safe is because it's not a fixed target that can be hit. It's a moving target.
Yeah,
And
it's
so if
funny.
you're a
So,
moving target, then you're safe.
yeah, so I got two little stories or soliloquies that I think you'll appreciate. So, one is this morning I was reading, I read in the news that the leader of Boko Haram was killed, which is this terrible terrorist organization in Nigeria. And so I read the obituary of him because it was just kind of just for whatever reason, it was there. And it talked about how he was the terrorist leader for like 12 years or something like that. I think since 2009. So yeah, 12 years. And he got to be so like paranoid, and whatnot, that his entire area where he lived was just filled with landmines and traps and every type of killing, defense mechanism that he could have, he would put surrounding him. And the only way they were able to get him was because some of his lieutenants turned on him, so they were able to infiltrate his compound. And it made me think, our little conversation just a minute ago, I remember reading several years back about the king of Jordan. And the king of Jordan has a lot of power, but I don't think he's an absolute monarch, but I think he just has a lot of power. And one thing I read about him is that the closer the family member is to the king, the closer they are to the center of the family, the less they think the king should have any power. So, the cousin of the king thinks the king should have a good amount of power. The king's wife thinks the king should be a constitutional monarch. The king thinks he should be a constitutional monarch. The brother, more middle situation, but the further off, the random person thinks the king should have all the power, but the king himself doesn't, so it's kind of interesting because it's exactly what you're saying about how, if you actually have the power, you don't even care about having the power, or you might even not want it because you're not afraid, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so the king of Jordan doesn't even want it, whereas this this terrorist guy was living in a hell of his own creation, a complete hell by having
Mm-hmm.
all this power that he accumulated over the years. So I don't know. I thought you'd, yeah.
Well, there's another story called the Prince and the Pauper. I think that in fact they made an opera out of it.
Yeah. We've talked
This
about this one. Yeah,
right, and the little
yeah,
kid who was a street urchin, he was doing just great, and he was discovered to be the prince, and so they put him in the palace with guards and all of that, and he hated it, and he escaped. He didn't like the
right,
fact that the palace was dangerous. That's why you have palace guards. If people got money, they need to protect it. If you don't have any money, you don't need to protect it.
right,
That's freedom.
right,
If you own a bunch of stuff, that means that you've got to be in a way you can say that anything that you own owns you. If you
right,
own a house, that means that that house depends upon you to take care of it. If you rent a house, now the landlord is the one who has to take care of the house. You don't have to take care of it anymore. You just live in the house, and if something is broken that doesn't get fixed, you don't have to fix it. It's up to the landlord to fix it.
right.
If you own that house, you've got to fix it yourself.
Sure. I
So it's
mean,
better not to
yeah.
own property, because if you own property, the property owns you. And every time the toilet breaks up or clogs up or something, guess what? You've got work to do.
So this brings us back to renunciation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So so in renunciation, like there's a lot of power in that, in a sense, because nothing's tying you down. You fully renounce, you know.
Oh, you're talking about renunciation in a different way than I'm talking about it. When I'm talking about renunciation, I'm talking about the idea of planning in the future to not do it. A vow, like the vow of poverty that the priest takes. Upon the ceremony, upon the time that he becomes a priest or whatever like that, is when he takes the vow.
Sure. And I'm
It's
talking
year
about
after
just,
year, day
yeah,
after day later that he has to deal with that vow.
right,
And so the whole point that we're talking about renunciation has to do with the vow itself, as opposed to the wisdom of noticing, for instance, right now is not a good day to buy a house.
sure,
And then tomorrow I come by and I say, right now, today is not a good day to buy a house. As opposed to renouncing ownership.
right.
Not now, not ever. Is That's way off into the future. That means that now we're setting a rule about the future. But if we can see right now it's not a good idea to buy the house, today is not a good idea about the house, then I don't have to renounce it.
So, so what do you think of the Buddha, who's so famous for renouncing the world?
He
Um,
didn't renounce the world. That's the
yeah,
story.
right. Is he first he did, and then he walked the middle way, which was not actually the path of
Right,
renunciation entirely.
right,
Yeah,
right. Renunciation is not a middle path. It's an extreme. Not
yeah,
now is a middle path. Not ever is extreme.
sure. So, do you feel like I'm sure you do, but do you feel like you're walking the middle path right now? You know, like do you ever
I'm
miss
not
the
walking.
robes?
I'm sitting.
You're sitting,
I'm sitting on
sitting, I
it.
should say. Yeah. You know, because I feel like the notion of the middle path, like that would be the goalposts kind of change for that, right? Like the middle path to someone living
Actually,
in,
the middle path is when
yeah.
you don't have extremes like gold poles. The goal is to have no gold poles.
Sure.
Goals are always at the extreme. You're always on the middle path when you don't have any goals, because the goal is either way over there or way over there.
Sure.
You've
You're
got no
you're already
goals,
on
here you
goal.
are.
Yeah,
No place to
already on
go.
goal. Interesting. So, you know, another thing that was interesting is, um, you know, I really enjoyed my retreat at Swan Moak, um, and I'd love to go back someday. Hopefully, somewhat soon. You know, depending on the whole COVID and everything. Um, I remember listening to one of the videos with Danny, and he talked about how he didn't have such a good time there. I don't know if he ever went back or not after that video. But is Dhammavidu still teaching there? Are they still doing it the way they used to do it? Um, like
In 2013, I think that he was still doing retreats at
yeah.
the International Dharma Hermitage. Now he spends, in fact, I think that he either spends half or all of his time at Deepa Bhawan, and when he's teaching at Deepa Bhawan, which is on the island, which is where Achan Po stays.
And
So,
I also saw
Dhamma,
a John Poe. I met a John Poe at
right.
the
So Achan
yeah.
Po is staying at as Deepa Bhawan, and that's where Dhamma V2 is teaching. However, I don't think that they're doing anything because of COVID right now. That they'll
Huh.
open back up soon enough, but right now they're between things. So everything is easy going, nothing's happening.
Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah. But yeah, hopefully I'll get out there sometime. But does Deepa Bhawan do retreats?
Wat Kautum, uh, Indira, the International Dhamma Hermitage, all of those do retreats. The
But
International
not.
Dhamma Hermitage is the one who does most of them in Thai, but Deepa Bhawan does Thai retreats also.
Uh, I thought the International Dhamma Heritage one that was in English when I went.
They have actually 3
Yeah.
retreats a month, 2 in Thai and 1 in English.
Ah, got it.
At Deepa Bhawan, they have generally 1 in Thai, 1 in English, and 1 in Russian.
Huh, cool. Lots of Russians. So I I would like to go to the English one. It would be nice to see a John Poe and also Damavidu again. That would be great. I don't know if they'll remember me, but be good to
Doesn't
yeah,
matter.
yeah. But anyhow, well,
You're
this has
not the
been a
same
really
one who was there in 2013 anyway.
no, I'm not. Neither are they. But anyhow, good stuff. So this was very useful today. I really appreciate it. Do you have, as always, it's always useful, you know. Um, but do you have any final concluding thoughts or any pointers or tips or yeah?
Yes, everything has to be back to this present moment.
Hmm.
Renunciation is planning for a future that you cannot right now control.
Mm.
The next one is about power. Wanting power is the same as wanting anything that you don't have. It's suffering. Getting yourself into a state of satisfaction is not suffering. Power is something, whether it's magical power or any other kind of power, power is sought because people are insecure. When
Right.
you are not insecure, when you feel secure, you don't need power. And therefore you don't want it. But somehow or another, it's self-evident.
Hello?